The polished mahogany door clicked shut behind her, a sound as final as a coffin lid. Rain lashed against the cold, unforgiving stone of the mansion she once called home, mingling with the tears she refused to let fall. In one hand, she gripped the handle of a single suitcase, packed not by her, but for her. In the other, a piece of paper, a severance package for a decade of her life, an insult disguised as a settlement. His last words still echoed in the stormy air, colder than the wind that whipped her hair across her face. "I need an heir, not a placeholder." And just like that, her world wasn't just broken. It was obliterated. The chandeliers in the dining room dripped crystals like frozen tears, casting a fractured, brilliant light over the scene. Adeline had always loved them. She'd chosen them herself on a trip to Venice, a memory that now felt like it belonged to another woman. Across the vast, immaculately polished rosewood table, Damien swirled a ruby-red Cabernet in his glass, the liquid catching the light, dark and heavy like blood. He hadn't looked at her, not really looked at her, all evening. His gaze was distant, his jaw set with a tension that coiled in the air between them, thick and suffocating. For 10 years, this opulence had been her reality, but tonight it felt like a beautifully constructed prison, and she was just beginning to see the bars. They had met when she was a fledgling art curator, and he was a man whose ambition was a tangible force, a gravity that pulled everyone into his orbit. He had swept her off her feet with a ferocity that left her breathless, promising a world she'd only read about in novels. He built an empire in speculative tech, and she had been his partner, his confidant, the quiet, steadying hand at his back. She'd hosted the dinners, charmed the investors, and sacrificed her own career to build his. Their life was a fortress of wealth and power, but there was one crack in its foundation, a fissure that had widened into a chasm over the years. They couldn't have a child. 3 rounds of IVF, countless specialists, and a string of heartbreaking failures had left a quiet sadness lingering in the vast, empty rooms of their mansion. Adeline had made her peace with it, suggesting adoption, suggesting a life just for them. Damien, however, had seen it as a personal failure, an unacceptable flaw in his perfect dynasty. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice devoid of the warmth she once cherished. It was the voice he used in the boardroom, the one that terminated contracts and dismantled competitors. Adeline placed her fork down, the delicate clink of silver against porcelain sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. "You've been distant for months, Damien. I know something's wrong." He didn't soften. He didn't offer comfort. He simply slid his phone across the table. On the screen was the image of a woman, young, beautiful, with a serene smile, and her hands resting protectively on a visibly pregnant stomach. Adeline's breath hitched. The woman was Claire, Damien's new executive assistant, a girl she'd met twice and thought nothing of. "Her name is Claire," Damien stated, as if presenting a quarterly report. "She's 26 weeks pregnant. It's a boy." The words didn't compute at first. They were just sounds, meaningless vibrations in the air. Then they landed, each one a physical blow. A boy. The son he'd always wanted. The heir he believed she had denied him. The air rushed from her lungs, and the crystal chandelier above seemed to sway. She felt a strange, dizzying detachment, as if she were floating above her own body, watching a scene from a tragic film. "How could you?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat, raw and broken. "It wasn't personal, Adeline. It was a matter of legacy," he said, his voice clipped and utterly devoid of remorse. "This company, this name, it needs to continue. You and we failed on that front. I've made a new arrangement." An arrangement. As if she were a faulty piece of machinery being replaced. The years of love, laughter, and shared dreams were reduced to a failed business transaction. The dam of her composure finally broke, and a hot, furious wave of betrayal washed over her. "An arrangement?" she repeated, her voice rising, trembling with a decade of suppressed frustrations and fresh agony. "I gave you everything. My life, my dreams. I stood by you when you had nothing but a crazy idea in a garage, and you call this an arrangement?" He was unmoved. "I've been more than fair. My lawyer has drawn up a final settlement. It's generous. You'll be comfortable." He gestured to the doorway. Claire was standing there, her expression a mixture of timid triumph and pity. It was the pity that cut Adeline the deepest. "Get out!" Adeline breathed, her gaze fixed on the woman carrying her husband's child. "I'm afraid it is you who will be leaving," Damien said, his tone final. "Claire and the baby will be living here. This is their home now." He stood up and walked to the grand foyer, where a single suitcase, her suitcase, stood waiting by the door. He'd planned this, every last, cruel detail. He opened the door, letting the cold, rainy night air rush into their warm, perfect home. He handed her an envelope. "Sign it. Have your lawyer look at it. I don't care. A car is waiting to take you to a hotel. My security will escort you." She stood frozen, the warmth of the room leaching from her skin. The life she knew was being surgically excised, and the man she loved was holding the scalpel. She looked from his cold, implacable face to Claire's gentle, pregnant form, and she understood. She was being replaced, erased. She walked toward the door, her movements stiff and robotic. She didn't look back at the crystal lights, the polished floors, the life she had built. She couldn't. As she stepped out into the storm, the weight of his betrayal was a physical burden, heavier than the suitcase in her hand, heavier than the world. The motel room smelled of stale cigarettes and despair. The floral-patterned bedspread was thin and scratchy, a universe away from the 1,000-thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets she had woken up in that morning. Adeline sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the generous settlement papers lying untouched beside her. $1 million. It sounded like a fortune to the woman she used to be, the art curator with a small apartment and big dreams. But to the wife of Damien Sterling, the man whose net worth was in the billions, it was pocket change. It was hush money. A tip left on the table after a 10-year meal. For 3 days, she didn't leave the room. The television flickered with meaningless images, the sounds a dull drone that couldn't penetrate the roaring in her head. She replayed that final scene over and over, dissecting every word, every cold glance. Legacy. He had said it was about legacy, but it wasn't. It was about his ego, a fragile, monstrous thing that she had spent a decade carefully tending to. She had been the perfect corporate wife, elegant and intelligent, a beautiful accessory that made him look good. But she had failed in her one biological duty, and for a man like Damien, that was unforgivable. Her mind drifted further back to the early days, the tiny apartment that was always filled with the smell of coffee and takeout as they worked late into the night on his business plan. The way he'd hold her and whisper, "It's you and me against the world, Addie." When had that man disappeared? Or had he ever really existed? Was he just a phantom she had constructed in her own mind? A projection of what she wanted him to be? The thought was terrifying. It meant her entire marriage, her entire adult life, was a lie. She thought of her own past, a childhood spent in the shadow of a domineering father who measured love in achievements. She had escaped that life only to find herself in a different kind of cage, a gilded one, but a cage nonetheless. She had made herself small to make Damien feel big. She had buried her own instincts, her own ambitions, so as not to threaten his. And this was her reward. On the fourth day, her phone buzzed. It had been silent for so long. Their friends, his friends, had all disappeared. Their loyalty bought and paid for. It was a number she hadn't dialed in years. Sophia, her younger sister. They'd had a falling out 5 years ago, a stupid argument about Damien's arrogance that had spiraled into a bitter silence. Sophia had seen something in him that Adeline had refused to acknowledge. "He doesn't see you, Addie," she had warned. "He sees a beautiful reflection of himself." With trembling fingers, Adeline answered, "Hello? Addie? Oh, thank God." Sophia's voice was a flood of relief and concern. "I saw it online, some gossip site. I've been trying to reach you. Where are you?" Adeline broke. The carefully constructed wall of numbness crumbled, and a decade of pain and a lifetime of insecurity came pouring out in a torrent of sobs. She told Sophia everything. The dinner, Claire, the suitcase, the motel. She cried for the life she had lost, for the woman she had ceased to be, and for the sister she had pushed away. Sophia listened patiently, without a single "I told you so." When Adeline was finished, her voice hoarse and her body shaking, Sophia's reply was simple and immediate. "I'm booking a flight. Tell me where you are. You're not alone in this anymore." 2 days later, Sophia arrived, a whirlwind of fierce, protective energy. She took one look at the grim motel room, at her sister's gaunt face and hollow eyes, and took charge. She tore up the settlement papers, letting the pieces drift into the cheap wastebasket like confetti at a funeral. "You are not signing that," she said, her voice steel. "That's not a settlement. That's an admission of defeat. We're not defeated." Sophia took Adeline to her small, cozy apartment in a city hundreds of miles away from the life Adeline had known. It was filled with books, half-finished paintings, and the scent of freshly brewed tea. It was a home, not a showroom. For the first time in a week, Adeline felt a flicker of something other than pain. It was a tiny, fragile ember of warmth. While Adeline slowly began to heal, piecing together the shattered fragments of her identity, Sophia started digging. She was a journalist, tenacious and resourceful. She read every article ever written about Damien Sterling, every fawning business profile, and every glossy magazine spread. She was looking for a crack, a vulnerability, anything. "Men like Damien," she told Adeline one evening, "they don't build empires without making enemies. They don't get that rich by being fair. Somewhere he cut a corner. Somewhere there's a body buried. Weeks turned into a month." The initial, all-consuming grief began to recede, leaving behind the hard, cold bedrock of anger. Adeline's world was no longer the four walls of a motel room. It was the comforting chaos of Sophia's apartment. She started cooking again, simple meals that filled the space with warmth. She read, she walked, and she slowly started to feel the edges of her own self again, the person she was before she became Mrs. Damien Sterling. But the anger remained, a low, constant hum beneath the surface. It was fueled by the tabloids Sophia sometimes left out, a calculated cruelty to keep the fire in Adeline's belly stoked. Billionaire Damien Sterling and expectant mother radiant at charity gala. They were building their new life on the rubble of hers, and the world was applauding them for it. One rainy afternoon, Adeline was sorting through the meager contents of the suitcase Damien had packed for her. It was a bizarre collection of designer clothes and expensive jewelry, items he thought defined her. At the bottom, tucked into the lining, her fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular. It was an old, leather-bound moleskin notebook. She didn't recognize it at first. Then, a memory surfaced. It was from years ago, in the garage apartment. Damien had used it for his initial brainstorming, scribbling down equations, market projections, and fragments of code. He'd moved on to sleeker, digital methods long ago, and this relic of his humble beginnings must have been forgotten, packed by a maid who simply cleared out a dusty drawer. She opened it, the pages smelling of old paper and ambition. Most of it was the technical jargon she'd never fully understood. But tucked into a flap at the back was a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of a signed agreement, a partnership dissolution. The signature alongside Damien's was one she didn't recognize: Nathan Hayes. The document stated that Nathan Hayes was relinquishing all claims and intellectual property related to their joint project, codenamed Prometheus, in exchange for a one-time payment of $50,000. The date on the document was just 3 months before Damien had secured his first round of major funding, the funding that had launched his empire. Prometheus. That was the name of the core algorithm that powered Sterling Innovations. Damien had always told everyone he developed it alone in a flash of solitary genius. He'd built his entire mythos on that story. But this document suggested otherwise. He'd had a partner he'd bought out for a pittance right before striking gold. "Sophia," Adeline called out, her voice trembling slightly. "You need to see this." Sophia read the document, her eyes narrowing. "Nathan Hayes," she murmured, already typing the name into her laptop. "If this is what I think it is, this isn't just a skeleton in his closet. This is the whole graveyard." The initial searches were fruitless. There was no Nathan Hayes in the tech world, no social media presence. It was a digital dead end. But Sophia was a journalist. She knew how to dig deeper. She pulled public records, property deeds, and old university alumni lists. After 2 days of relentless searching, she found him. Or what was left of him. Nathan Hayes had died 7 years ago. A reported suicide. He had been struggling with depression and financial ruin after a series of failed ventures. He left behind a wife and a daughter. His widow, Sarah Hayes, now worked as a librarian in a small town in Oregon. "Oh my God," Adeline breathed, looking at the faded photograph of Nathan on a memorial website. He had a kind, intelligent face. He looked like a man who could have been Damien's friend, before Damien decided friendship was a liability. "This is it, Addie," Sophia said, her voice low and intense. "This is the weak point. Damien didn't just outsmart a partner, he erased him. He built his legacy on a man's grave. The story he told the world is a lie." A sudden, chilling thought occurred to Adeline. The settlement, the $1 million, it wasn't just an insult, it was a strategy. By offering her a settlement, Damien was creating a paper trail that made their split look like a standard, albeit acrimonious, divorce. If she signed, she'd be legally bound by a non-disclosure agreement. It wasn't about being generous, it was about ensuring her silence. He wasn't just getting rid of a barren wife, he was getting rid of a witness. She had been there in the early days. She might not have understood the code, but she remembered the late-night arguments, the hushed phone calls, the name Nathan being spoken in anger. He was afraid of what she might remember. The hum of anger inside her sharpened into a single, clear note of purpose. This was no longer just about her pain, her betrayal. It was about Nathan Hayes. It was about the life he never got to live, the family he left behind. Damien hadn't just thrown her out. He had underestimated her. He had mistaken her quiet grace for weakness. He thought she was just an accessory he could discard. He was about to find out how wrong he was. "Find me a lawyer," Adeline said, her voice steady and cold. "Not a divorce lawyer, a shark? Someone who isn't afraid of Damien Sterling." Finding the right lawyer felt like searching for a ghost. The top-tier corporate law firms in the city were all tangled in Damien's web. They had either represented Sterling Innovations in the past or desperately wanted to. Taking on a case against him would be professional suicide. They were offered retainers far larger than Adeline could ever afford, only to politely decline after a single phone call, their hushed tones suggesting a warning had been delivered from on high. Damien was protecting his kingdom, and his influence was a long, dark shadow. It was Sophia, through an old journalism contact, who finally found a name: Leo Roman. He wasn't on the top floor of a skyscraper. His office was on the 4th floor of a creaky pre-war building, the kind with a cage elevator and radiators that hissed like angry snakes. The sign on his door was simple: L. Roman, Escors, specializing in financial justice. Leo was not what Adeline expected. He was a man in his late 50s with a weary face, a rumpled suit, and eyes that seemed to have seen the very worst of human greed. His office was a chaotic mess of paper, stacks of legal briefs, depositions, and financial records teetered precariously on every surface. But beneath the disarray, there was a sense of fierce, focused intelligence. He wasn't a corporate lawyer. He was a brawler, a street fighter who had spent his career representing whistleblowers, defrauded employees, and small-time inventors crushed by corporate behemoths. He had a reputation for taking impossible cases and, more often than not, winning them through sheer, relentless attrition. He listened to Adeline's story without interruption, his gaze fixed on her face, assessing her. He steepled his fingers, his expression unreadable. When she finished, placing the copy of the partnership dissolution on his cluttered desk, he finally spoke. "Damien Sterling," Leo said, his voice a low rumble. "I know the name. He's a predator dressed in a $1,000 suit. But he's insulated. He has the best legal team money can buy. To go after him, you don't just need a smoking gun. You need an arsenal. This document is a start. It's a good start, but it's not enough." "What do you need?" Adeline asked, her voice steady. The timid woman from the mansion was gone. In her place was someone focused, someone with nothing left to lose. "Proof," Leo said. "Proof that this Prometheus algorithm was substantially Nathan Hayes' work. Proof that Damien coerced him into signing this. Right now, this is just a piece of paper. Damien's lawyers will paint Hayes as a disgruntled minor partner who cashed out too early. They'll paint you as a bitter, vengeful ex-wife. We need more." The search began. It was a slow, painstaking process. Leo filed an initial discovery motion that was immediately buried in an avalanche of legal challenges from Damien's team. They were building a wall of paper to slow them down. Meanwhile, Sophia flew to Oregon to meet with Sarah Hayes. The widow was hesitant at first, the wound still raw even after 7 years. She described a husband who had grown paranoid and despondent, talking about being cheated, about his life's work being stolen. He had fallen into a deep depression he never recovered from. But she had no hard evidence, only the painful memories of a broken man. She did, however, have a key. A key to a storage unit Nathan had rented in the final months of his life. He had told her it was just old university junk. After he died, she had kept paying the bill, unable to bring herself to sort through the remnants of his shattered dreams. Sophia convinced her to open it. The unit was cold and damp, filled with dusty boxes of textbooks and old computer equipment. But in the back, behind a stack of obsolete monitors, was a heavy, locked metal footlocker. Leo, using the legal authority of representing the Hayes estate, had a locksmith open it. Inside was Nathan Hayes' ghost. There were hard drives, zip disks, and stacks of notebooks filled with handwritten code. It was a meticulous archive of his work, his entire creative process from conception to near completion of the Prometheus algorithm. Most importantly, there was a log of his correspondence with Damien, emails he had printed out, detailing their collaboration, their shared excitement, and then the growing tension. The final emails were heartbreaking. Nathan begging Damien to reconsider, accusing him of locking him out of their shared servers, of changing the code and claiming it as his own. Damien's replies were cold, dismissive, threatening legal action if Nathan didn't accept the buyout. But the real treasure was a small, unassuming digital audio recorder. On it was a single recording, made on the day Nathan signed the dissolution agreement. It was a conversation between him and Damien. Damien's voice was smooth, persuasive, and utterly chilling. He could be heard talking about Nathan's mounting debts, his wife's medical bills, the precariousness of their situation. He framed the $50,000 buyout not as a betrayal, but as a lifeline. "Take the deal, Nate," Damien's voice echoed from the small speaker. "It's a sure thing. This startup world, it's a gamble. 99% of them fail. This way you walk away with something. You can take care of your family." It was coercion, dressed up as concern. Back in Leo's office, they listened to the recording in stunned silence. This was it. This was the weapon. "We have him," Leo said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "This is fraud, coercion, and the foundation of a wrongful death suit. We can ruin him." But as Adeline listened to the desperation in Nathan's voice and the cold calculation in her husband's, she knew that simply ruining him wasn't enough. Money wouldn't bring Nathan back. She looked at the schematic of Sterling Innovations' corporate structure that Leo had pinned to a corkboard. It was a vast, sprawling empire. An empire built on a lie. An empire he cherished more than any person. It wasn't his money she wanted. It was his legacy. The very thing he had destroyed her for. "No," Adeline said quietly, her eyes fixed on the board. "We're not going to sue him. Not yet. We're going to take it all." Leo looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his weary eyes. He was seeing the same steely resolve he'd seen in 100 whistleblowers and victims before. He was seeing a fighter. The strategy shifted from a legal assault to a corporate one. It was audacious, bordering on impossible. Leo, invigorated by a challenge he hadn't seen in years, embraced it with a feral glee. "He thinks he's a king?" Leo growled, pacing his cluttered office. "The only way to dethrone a king is to turn his own court against him." Their plan was twofold. First, they needed leverage, the kind that would make the board of Sterling Innovations and their investors panic. Second, they needed capital, a significant amount, to execute a hostile takeover. The audio recording was their leverage. The capital was a far greater challenge. Adeline sold everything she had left from her old life. The jewelry, the designer bags, even the shares in a small art gallery she had co-owned before her marriage. It was a respectable sum, but a drop in the ocean compared to what they needed. Their break came from an unexpected place. Leo, using his network of contacts, found another victim of Damien's ambition. A man named George Croft, a seasoned venture capitalist who had been one of Damien's earliest mentors. Damien had pushed him out of a lucrative deal years ago, using inside information to undercut him and steal the opportunity. George, now semi-retired and nursing a decade-old grudge, had been waiting for a chance at payback. The meeting took place in a private club that smelled of old leather and older money. George Croft was a portly man, with a sharp mind and eyes that missed nothing. He listened to the audio recording of Damien and Nathan, his expression hardening with each word. "That's the Damien I remember," George said, swirling a glass of scotch. "A shark who was never satisfied with just a piece of the pie. He wanted the whole damn bakery." He looked at Adeline, his gaze assessing. "This is a long shot, young lady. You're going up against an army." "I'm aware," Adeline replied, her voice calm and even. "But he's arrogant. He won't see this coming, especially not from me. He thinks I'm broken. He thinks I'm irrelevant." George smiled, a slow, predatory grin. Arrogance, the fatal flaw of so many great men. "All right, I'm in. I'll put together a consortium. We'll create a series of shell corporations to start buying up Sterling Innovations stock. We'll move quietly, a percentage point at a time. He won't even notice until it's too late." While George and his consortium began their silent financial siege, Adeline and Leo prepared the narrative. They knew they couldn't just drop the evidence. They had to control the story, to frame it in a way that left Damien with no escape. They prepared a meticulously documented dossier, complete with Nathan Hayes' notebooks, the printed emails, the audio recording, and a detailed financial analysis showing that nearly 80% of the company's profits could be traced back to the stolen Prometheus algorithm. As their plan gained momentum, Damien began to feel the pressure, though he didn't yet know its source. He became increasingly paranoid and volatile. Adeline, through Sophia's continued monitoring of the press, saw the change. He looked strained in photos. There were rumors of shouting matches in the boardroom, of him firing senior staff for minor infractions. The pressure was making the cracks in his perfect facade begin to show, and he started to lash out. Adeline found the tires on her car slashed one morning. Leo received a visit from 2 large men with an unspoken warning to drop the case. A key investor in George's consortium suddenly pulled out, citing unforeseen financial difficulties that felt anything but coincidental. Damien was fighting back, using the brutish, intimidating tactics of a cornered animal. But instead of frightening Adeline, it hardened her. Each act of aggression only served to reinforce the truth of who he was. This was the real Damien, the man who lurked beneath the charming, polished exterior. She was no longer fighting the ghost of the man she had loved. She was fighting the monster that had been there all along. Her internal struggle was not one of fear, but of morality. She was becoming something she never thought she would be: ruthless, calculating, and patient. She was wielding secrets and other people's money like weapons, preparing to destroy a man's life. Some nights she lay awake, the voice of the old Adeline whispering in her ear, asking if this was truly justice or just a more sophisticated form of revenge. But then she would think of Nathan Hayes, of his widow Sarah and the daughter who grew up without a father. She would think of the condescending pity in Claire's eyes and the cold, dismissive finality in Damien's. And she knew she couldn't stop. She had to see this through. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person Damien had ever stepped on to build his crooked throne. She was the ghost of all his past sins, and she was coming to collect. The 8-month mark of Claire's pregnancy coincided with the peak of Damien's paranoia. The pressure of the silent stock acquisition and the whispers of a legal challenge he couldn't identify were taking their toll. The charming, attentive partner she had fallen for was gone, replaced by a man who was short-tempered, suspicious, and obsessed with control. The mansion no longer felt like a palace. It felt like a high-security prison. He had her followed. He checked her phone. He questioned every call, every expenditure. He saw threats in every shadow. Claire had entered into this relationship with naive, star-struck eyes. Damien was powerful, brilliant, and he had chosen her. She believed his story about his cold, unhappy marriage. She believed he loved her. She believed the child they were having was the start of a beautiful new family. But the man she was living with now was not the man from her dreams. His cruelty, once a trait she knew he reserved for business rivals, was now leaking into their life. He would make casually cutting remarks about her weight gain, her simplistic view of the world, her choice of friends. He was isolating her, just as he had isolated Adeline. One evening, after a particularly tense day where a major investor had liquidated a huge block of shares without explanation, Damien came home in a rage. He had been drinking. He found Claire in the nursery, softly folding baby clothes. "What do you think you're doing?" he snarled, his voice slurring slightly. "Just getting the room ready," she said, startled by his tone. "This is all your fault," he muttered, pacing the room. "If it wasn't for this whole situation, she'd have just taken the money and disappeared. But no, you had to be the picture of domestic bliss. You had to be flaunted. It made her angry. It made her fight back." Claire was confused and frightened. "Fight back? Who? Adeline?" Damien let out a bitter laugh. "Her. The ghost. Someone is trying to ruin me, Claire. Someone is digging into things. Things from a long time ago. She must be behind it. The vengeful wife. It's so predictable. He suddenly stopped pacing and grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. Did you talk to her? Did she contact you? No, of course not! Damien, you're hurting me! She cried, trying to pull away. He released her abruptly, a flicker of something, disgust or self-loathing in his eyes. He looked around the perfect nursery, at the tiny clothes and stuffed animals. Legacy, he spat, the word tasting like poison. I blew up my life for a legacy, and now I have a target on my back and a child on the way with a woman who can't even comprehend the world I live in. He stormed out, leaving Claire trembling among the soft, pastel-colored decorations. In that moment, the illusion shattered completely. He didn't love her. He was using her. She and their unborn son were just pieces in his grand game, a move he had made to secure his dynasty. And now that the game was threatened, they had become a liability. For the first time, she felt a profound, chilling kinship with the woman she had replaced. She finally understood that Adeline wasn't the villain of Damien's story. She was his first victim. Fear for her future, and the future of her child, consumed her. She thought about leaving, but he controlled her finances, her home, her life. She was trapped. A few days later, driven by a desperate need to understand the danger she was in, she did something reckless. She used Damien's password, a combination of his mother's birthday and the name of his first dog, a detail he'd once shared in a rare moment of sentimentality, to access his private server. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she found a hidden, encrypted folder. The password hint was NH Folly. She thought of the way he'd been muttering about the past, and a name from a news article about his early career came to mind. Nathan Hayes. She typed it in, and the folder opened. Inside was everything. The original partnership agreement with Nathan, scans of Nathan's early code, and a file labeled Contingency. It was an audio file. She clicked play and heard a voice she recognized from the news, Damien's. But it was a recording of the conversation he'd had with Nathan Hayes, the one where he coerced him into signing away his life's work. Damien had kept a copy, as insurance, as a trophy. She didn't know, but listening to his cold, calculated manipulation of a desperate man made her feel sick. She now held the proof of the crime that was the source of his paranoia. She knew, with absolute certainty, that if he discovered what she had found, she would be in real danger. He wouldn't hesitate to remove her from the equation, just as he had removed Nathan and Adeline. With shaking hands, she copied the file onto a tiny, encrypted USB drive. She didn't know what Adeline was planning, but she knew that woman was the only other person who understood the truth. Using a prepaid burner phone she bought with cash from an ATM, she found a secure, anonymous email service. She sent a single, unsigned message to a private contact address for Leo Roman's firm, an address Sophia had once mentioned in a news article about whistleblowers. The message contained only 3 things: a time, a place for a dead drop, and the words, "I have his contingency file, the proof you need. He is not the man you think he is." She was no longer a pawn in his game. She was changing the board. The day of the annual general meeting of Sterling Innovations was a major event in the financial world. It was held in a cavernous, state-of-the-art auditorium, packed with shareholders, board members, and the press. This year was particularly significant. Damien was set to announce a monumental merger with a European tech giant, a deal that would make his company an untouchable global behemoth. It was to be the crowning achievement of his career, the final, unassailable brick in his legacy. He stood at the podium, basking in the applause, the picture of power and success. The paranoia of the past few months had been temporarily suppressed by the intoxicating thrill of this ultimate victory. He launched into his speech, his voice booming with confidence, painting a glorious picture of future profits and market domination. He was at the absolute zenith of his power, a king addressing his loyal subjects. He didn't notice the quiet, unassuming woman who slipped into a reserved seat in the back row. Adeline. She looked different. The soft, deferential demeanor was gone, replaced by a still, formidable composure. She was not here as a victim. She was here as an executioner. As Damien prepared to introduce the CEO of the European firm for the final signing, a single email was sent from Leo Roman's office. It went to every board member, every major shareholder, and every journalist in the room. The subject line was simple: "The true foundation of sterling innovations." The email contained a link to a secure, password-protected website. A moment later, a second email provided the password: Nathan Hayes. On stage, Damien's tablet, which was projecting his speech notes, flickered. A message appeared on the screen, visible only to him. "Check your email. Your legacy is over." He paled. A low murmur began to ripple through the auditorium as people opened their phones and laptops. The murmur grew into a wave of shocked gasps. On the website, they found everything: Nathan Hayes' notebooks, the scanned emails, the financial breakdown of the company's reliance on the Prometheus algorithm. And at the very top, an embedded audio player with the full, unedited recording of Damien coercing Nathan Hayes into signing away his future. Damien stared out at the sea of faces, no longer looking at him with admiration, but with horror and contempt. His confident smile faltered, replaced by a mask of disbelief. "These are baseless allegations," he stammered into the microphone, his voice suddenly thin and reedy. "This is a smear campaign by a person with a vendetta." But it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable. The CEO of the European company, who had been waiting in the wings, was now being hurried away by his aides, his face a thunderous mask of fury. The deal was dead. And then the final blow. Adeline stood up from her seat in the back. A hush fell over the room as all eyes turned to her. She walked calmly and deliberately down the aisle, not towards the stage, but towards the chairman of the board, an elderly, distinguished man named Arthur Vance. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice clear and strong, amplified by the microphone of a journalist who rushed to her side. "My name is Adeline Roberts. My former name was Sterling. For the past 6 months, a consortium of investors, represented by Mr. George Croft and myself, has been acquiring a controlling interest in this company. As of this morning, we hold 51% of the voting shares." A collective gasp went through the room. Damien looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. "We have the votes," Adeline continued, her gaze finally locking with Damien's across the room. She felt no triumph, only a quiet, resolute finality. "And we are calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in CEO Damien Sterling. We are voting to remove him from his position and from the board, effective immediately." It was a corporate coup, executed with surgical precision in the most public forum imaginable. Damien was speechless, his face ashen. He was being dismantled piece by piece in front of the entire world. The board, seeing the irrefutable evidence and the sudden dramatic shift in power, scrambled to save themselves and the company. The vote was a mere formality. Damien Sterling, the untouchable king of tech, was thrown out of his own kingdom. As security guards, with apologetic but firm expressions, approached the stage to escort him out, his eyes found Adeline's one last time. In them, she saw not hatred, but a dawning, terrifying understanding. She hadn't just taken his company, she had taken his name. She had taken his story. She had taken the only thing he ever truly loved, his legacy. And she had done it without raising her voice, without shedding a tear. She had simply exposed the truth. In the aftermath, the financial world was in an uproar. Sterling Innovations' stock plummeted, but only briefly. The new controlling interest, led by Adeline and George Croft, moved swiftly to stabilize the company. Adeline, in a move that shocked everyone, did not take the title of CEO. She became the chairwoman of the board, the architect of the company's new future. Her first act was to issue a public apology to Sarah Hayes and her daughter. She flew to Oregon to meet them in person, not for a photo opportunity, but for a quiet, private conversation. She established a foundation in Nathan Hayes' name, funded by a significant portion of the company's annual profits, dedicated to supporting young, struggling inventors and their families. The company itself was rebranded. Sterling Innovations became Prometheus Labs, a name that honored its true creator. Adeline didn't just want to erase Damien, she wanted to correct the past. Richard was left with a fraction of his former wealth and a reputation that was utterly toxic. He was a social and professional pariah. The merger was dead, his friends had vanished, and his name was synonymous with fraud. He was a ghost in the world he once ruled. A few weeks after the takeover, Adeline received a request for a meeting. It was from Claire. They met in a neutral, quiet cafe. Claire was visibly nervous, her son now a newborn, sleeping peacefully in a carrier beside her. "I wanted to thank you," Claire said, her voice soft. "And to apologize. I was foolish. I believed a story he told me, and I never stopped to think about the person on the other side of it." Adeline looked at the young woman, and she felt no anger, only a strange sense of empathy. Claire was just another person who had been dazzled and then discarded by Damien. "He has a way of making people believe what he wants them to," Adeline said simply. She then made Claire an offer. A trust fund would be established for her son, enough to provide for his education and his future, completely independent of Damien. It came with one condition. The child was to be raised with Claire's last name, with no connection to the Sterling legacy. He was an innocent, and he deserved a life free from the poison of his father's name. Claire agreed, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. She was being given a second chance, a gift of grace she never expected. The story ends a year later. A news report is playing on a television in a cheap, lonely bar. It features Adeline Roberts, the chairwoman of Prometheus Labs, announcing a new scholarship program for underprivileged students in STEM. She is poised, respected, and radiant. Watching the screen is a man with hollow eyes and a glass of cheap whiskey in his hand. It is Damien. He is a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that has forgotten him, watching the woman he threw away build a better empire on the ashes of his. Adeline is not in a boardroom. She is walking along a wind-swept beach, the same one where Damien proposed to her all those years ago. The air is clean and salty. For a long time, she had thought her story was a tragedy, but she now knows it was a story of liberation. She had lost a gilded cage, and in doing so, had found her own strength, her own purpose, her own soul. She was finally free. Adeline chose to build something new from the wreckage of her past. She offered grace to the woman who helped destroy her marriage, and chose justice over simple, bitter revenge. But the path she walked was a difficult one, forcing her to become as ruthless and calculating as the man who wronged her. So, we want to ask you, the viewer, if you were in her shoes, with the power to utterly destroy the person who shattered your life, what would you have done? Would you have been as merciful? Let us know in the comments below.